Hi, I'm Sarah and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk to you about all of the books that I read in the month of May. So May was a bit of a strange reading month for me. It didn't start off amazingly well and I got into a bit of a reading slump which lasted at least like a week, maybe a week and a half. And I'll talk to you about some of the reasons why. But in the end, towards the end of the month, I had an amazing time with my reading, so it sort of evened out. I ended up reading 8 books this month, and I DNF'd 3 books as well on top of that. So it does sound like quite a lot, but I would say that there was like a good week where I really wasn't reading very much at all, or I was like trying to picking up a book and I couldn't concentrate. And that's, I think, because of the 3 DNFs that I had them like all in succession, and then I managed to find a book that I liked, so it was a bit tough. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you through them in the order of worst to best. I'm going to mention the 3 DNFs quickly. It's not like none of these were bad books, they were just books that I was not in the mood for, or yeah, they were just like, I'll explain as we go. But okay, so the first DNF that I had was Letters to Camondo by Edmund de Waal. I think that's how you say his name, I'm not sure. So I had read his previous book, which is The Hare with the Amber Eyes, and I'd really liked it. It's a non-fiction book. It's a family history told through these like little ornaments that his family own, and it talks about like from their manufacture up until like how they currently are still in his possession. It was an amazing book. Like, it was very popular when it came out. I read it years ago and I really, really liked it. So I wanted to read more of his writing. He's a famous potter, I believe. I've not really looked at much of his ceramic work, but I think it's meant to be really good. This is, I guess, in the same vein that it's him writing letters to a friend of his ancestors. So it's a family that owned a house on the same street as his ancestors in Paris, I think. And this wasn't a bad book. It's letters to this man. He's a count, Count Moise de Camondo. So it's his letters to him, but it sort of discusses all of the furniture in his house. It's like descriptions of this random man's house that I've not been in. There are pictures in it, but yeah, it's just like don't really care that much. And I was just getting to the point. It's not even a long book, but I was just getting to the point where I was like, I don't really want to pick this up. I don't really care about like how all of these objects in this random man's house were made. It also, like from the start, wasn't particularly clear who this man was in relation to the author. It was like, yeah, like letters to him. So at no point was this like, I'm going to write letters to this man who blah 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 blah. And I think you were going to learn his story throughout the letters, but I got like a third of the way through. I still had no context. There sort of started to be a description of all the horses he owned and his wife, but like I didn't have a good sense of who the man was, so I didn't really care. But yeah, there were loads of like pictures throughout. It's actually like a really beautifully published book. I just wasn't in the mood for it, so I ended up just putting this one down. I only bought it like maybe at the end of April. I just bought it off a second-hand book website and read it pretty much, well, DNF'd it, but like started it pretty much straight away. So that was a bit of a shame. But I think I probably will just get rid of that one because I'm not, like, I don't feel keen to pick it up again. The next one that I DNF'd, this is one that was like on my physical TBR for all the books I'm trying to read that I owned before the start of the year. And that's Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre. I had a feeling I wasn't really going to like this. I read At the Existentialist Cafe last year by Sarah Bakewell, which talked about phenomenology and sort of the existentialist movement in France, specifically about Sartre and Camus and Simone de Beauvoir. And I found it all really interesting, like the actual theory of their thought and their relationships together. But this book, it just made me really depressed reading it. It's this man who he's studying some obscure count. He's like starting to feel quite disillusioned with life. I can see where all of the philosophy comes into it, because he goes to this bar and he's like looking at all of the colours of everything, and everything starts to like blur in front of his eyes and he can't make anything out, and he's getting, I don't know, it's just quite depressive and anxiety inducing, and I wasn't enjoying it. I was like, it's a very short book, it's like 225 pages. I was like, I'll try and read 25 pages a day, and I couldn't even get through that. I was just like not enjoying being in this man's mind. So I put it down, which is a bit of a shame. I would maybe try some of Sartre's other work. I don't really love these books of like very anxious people going about their life alone and not really speaking to people. It doesn't put me in a good headspace. So I put this one down. So the next one that I DNF'd is The Guide by Narayan. This is one that I took out of the library like last year, and then someone else had requested it, so I had to take it back. And then I saw it in a second-hand bookshop, and I like really liked this cover. They actually had like a whole range of his books with the same covers. I was really tempted to buy quite a lot of them, but then I thought, oh, what if I don't like them? And this was a case of it not being a bad book, but I was reading it at the same time as Nausea, and just the two of these together, I was like I was not having a good time. So I put this one down, but I might not DNF it forever. This basically is about a corrupt tourist guide. So at the start, he's living sort of at a temple. He's essentially a beggar, and he starts to like get followers by telling the people that he can help them with their famine and stuff, and they all believe him. And it goes back into his childhood and when he started showing tourists around the area. But yeah, I don't know what it was about this one. It just seemed like I just didn't care enough where it was going, and because I was reading Nausea at the same time, I didn't have enough momentum to push me through it. So I put this one down. I might try again in the future. So then the next book that I did read and finished and quite enjoyed, like I don't really give my books star ratings, but I'd say this was a solid 3-star, is by Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept by Elizabeth Smart. This book I picked up at work. So basically I work, my office is within a hotel, and one of the guests had left this on the bookshelf in the lounge, and I'd heard about it. I'd heard Jack Edwards talking about it, raving about it, so I picked it up last year, and then it's been sitting on my bookshelf, and then I saw Leah Crumpton talking about it, and she gave it 5 stars as well. So I was like, okay, right, I need to pick this up and give it a go. The writing in this is so beautiful, but the problem I had was it's basically a book of poetry that's been turned into a novel, but calling this a novel, like there's no story that really runs throughout it. So I made the mistake of not reading the introduction. There's an introduction in this by Jan Martel, and normally I don't really read the introductions to books because quite often they give away a lot of the plot. So I was like, I'll read the book and then I'll read the introduction. And when I was reading the book, I remembered Jack Edwards' review. He was like saying that it was about this woman who went to a bookshop in London and picked out this poetry collection of this poet and fell in love with his work so much that she basically started stalking him. She invited him and his wife to visit her in LA, and then she had an affair with him and had 4 children with him. But if I hadn't known that, like this book gives me none of that. You can tell that it's about a married man who leaves, well, he doesn't even really leave his wife, but who has an affair with the narrator of this book. And it's basically a book of like heartbreak and love, but it's all very, very flowery language, but no context. And when I went back and read the introduction, it then explained all of this story of what actually happened, but I got none of that from the book itself. And I don't really like books like that. Like, I need to know what's going on and the reasons why why the author is so in love and how she feels betrayed, like what's happened to make her feel betrayed. Just her writing lots of like flowery prose about her betrayal and her heartbreak gives me nothing because I have no context. I need to know what's gone on. But the writing was really beautiful in this, and it's a very short book. It's like 120 pages, so if you like really poetic writing about love, I would pick this up. It's just not really my jam, but it was still an interesting book to read, and I'm glad that I picked it up. Next book I read was In the House of the Interpreter by Ngugi with Thiongo. This is the second book in a series of 4 memoirs. He split it up into 4 sections, so I read the first one, which was called Dreams in a Time of War, which is about his childhood. I read that last month, or the month before, and then straight away I really liked it. I straight away ordered this off a secondhand book website, and this I did like, but unfortunately this was when I was sort of in my reading slump, so I was struggling to concentrate on it. And this is about his time in high school. He goes to this, he gets really good grades in his primary school, and he goes to this really prestigious high school, but at the same time a lot of the stuff that's going on in his village at home, like his village has basically been moved into this concentration camp, and the British colonialists are trying to shut down the independence movement in Kenya. So it's really interesting historically, but I found this a bit too segmented for me. Like there were sort of stories about him playing football at school, and then there was like a bit about he went home and like his house had turned into a concentration camp, and then it went back to talk about all of the books he read at school, and I kind of wanted a more succinct narrative. Like I don't know what the focus of this book was. Like maybe he's just telling his story and his, because it is his memoir, but I thought that maybe if you wanted to focus on like the political issues in the country, that it would have been better if it had more of a focus. But this book is like, some of the stuff that happens in this book is devastating. Like he, towards the end of the book, he ends up in prison. I'll definitely continue on this series because I'm learning so much about the terrible stuff that the British did in Kenya. Like some of this I had no idea about. And the other reason why I picked this series up is because I tried to read A Grain of Wheat by this author, and I just felt like I was lacking the context, so I wanted to go back and read about his life, so that when I try and read A Grain of Wheat again, I can understand what's happened to him and why the characters are doing what they're doing. So this was like definitely a solid read. I just didn't have the concentration span, and I think because it was a little bit like, it just felt like little snippets of things that I was then struggling to be able to put it all together in my head. But I will definitely continue on this autobiographical series, and yeah, I did really enjoy it. Okay, so next are two books that I'm filming a reading vlog for, so I'm not going to talk about them too much, but these are books that are on my physical TBR that I'm trying to get through. So the first one is Solar Bones by McCormack. This is a book that's essentially written all in one sentence, which sounds really gimmicky, but I really enjoyed this book. I thought the writing in it was beautiful. So this is about like a middle-aged engineer in Ireland who's reflecting on his life and sort of the interconnectedness of the world, what's going on in politics in his town and how that affects his life personally. I really liked a lot of the musings in this, and I thought the writing was beautiful. So this was like a very solid read for me, and I'm really glad I picked it up. But yes, more thoughts are in the reading vlog that's coming. And then one of the other books that I read in that reading vlog is The House of Ulloa by Emilia, Pardo, Bazan. I find it like, I really enjoyed both of these books, so it's kind of hard to say which one I preferred more, but this is sort of like a gothic 19th century Spanish classic that's written by a female author. It's about a priest that goes to live in this sort of stately home in Galicia, and it all follows on from there. Again, I'm not going to say too much because I have my thoughts in another vlog, but the writing in this was incredible. Some of the scenes were like so vivid, and yeah, I thought this was like, if you're it's quite a short classic. If you're looking for sort of an interesting Spanish story, I would definitely pick this one up. So the next book is a library book that I have since returned to the library, but I really enjoyed this book. So this is Erewhon by Samuel Butler. I picked this up because I had been listening to a podcast a couple of years ago called The History of Ideas by David Runciman. It's a podcast that my boyfriend really loves. He's really into politics, and it's sort of the history of political ideas. And he mentions Samuel Butler in it, and he has a full episode talking about the book Erewhon. And because I hadn't listened to this podcast in a couple of years, a lot of the details have sort of faded from my mind, but I knew it was a book about like a sort of utopian world almost, or dystopian, depending on which way you look at it. And so I saw that my library had a copy, so I decided to borrow it. And yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I think because I had listened to the podcast, and I went back after I read the book and I re-listened to the podcast, and it was like a really good experience because there's a lot that I maybe hadn't taken from it that when I listened to the podcast again, I was like, oh yeah, I did say that. So this is essentially a book that is set in some other land. You're meant to think, based on the author's biographical life, that it's probably New Zealand, because he lived in New Zealand for a while. And he goes on a journey, and he sort of enters into this strange place where everything's a bit topsy-turvy. So instead of you going to jail for committing a crime, you go to jail for being sick. So it's almost sickness is punished and crime goes unpunished. So people will say, instead of saying that they're sick, they'll say that they're like an alcoholic, or they'll say that they like feel like stealing something today, so they need to stay at home, when actually they're sick, because they know that if they say they're sick, they're going to go to jail. So I suppose you start to think, why is crime punished so severely and sickness not at all, and vice versa? I don't know, it's just a really interesting thought experiment, and the whole book was basically a thought experiment. When I went onto Goodreads after reading this and looked at the reviews, they were terrible. They were like 2.8 or something, which is so low. I've never seen a book that low. And I think it's because if you go into it expecting a novel, it's not really a novel. It's essentially a thought experiment. And there are lots of other themes that he goes into. Some of the stuff he says about machinery is like so eerie, because this book was written in like 1870. And he talks about how when you get to a point where you've developed machinery, and then you reach a certain point where you can't undo it, because the machinery is going to like self-propagate, if you know what I mean. And we're almost at that point now where like we can't survive without machinery. So in a sense, machinery does have control over our lives. Like we couldn't go anywhere without a car. We couldn't do anything without our phones. We were like so reliant on technology that we were past the point of being able to get rid of it and live self-sufficient lives, because the knowledge of how to do things without technology is gone. So yeah, some of that stuff is like really quite spooky for the time that we live in. So I thought this was really good. But if you're looking for like a novel, it's not the best plot. You know, it's like he's basically trying to shoehorn his ideas into a novel format, but yeah, it's not really a novel, if that makes sense. So then next I read What Belongs to You by Garth Greenwell. I read Cleanness by Garth Greenwell last year and I really loved it. And this is his first novel, so he wrote this before Cleanness. This is a continuation of the same themes. So it's about an American school teacher in Bulgaria. So he lives in Sofia, and he's queer, and he's basically about his encounters with men. It's very sexually explicit. There are a lot of sex scenes in it. And it talks about shame, it talks about desire, and there were just some beautiful lines in this. In the middle, he sort of talks about his experience with his dad. Again, this is sort of like almost a vignette, so there are like 3 sections in this book, and each one, they're almost like, well, especially the middle section where it talks about his dad is like a completely separate story. And then the 3rd section goes back to talk about the man who the book's mainly about, which is this younger man called Mitko, who he meets in the bathroom, and they have a sort of sexual encounter, and then they go on to have a sort of strained relationship. But yeah, just the writing in this book is really beautiful. I didn't like it quite as much as Cleanness. I think just because this is his first novel, he's developed quite a lot as a writer since. But yeah, some of the lines in this book are so beautiful. I'll read this bit. This is like it's like 10 pages from the end of the book. He says, "Making poems was a way of loving things I had always thought, of preserving them, of living moments twice, or more than that. It was a way of living more fully, of bestowing on experience a richer meaning. But that wasn't what it felt like. When I looked back at the boy wanting a last glimpse of him, it felt like a loss. Whatever I could make of him would diminish him, and I wondered whether I wasn't really turning my back on things and making them into poems, whether instead of preserving the world, I was taking refuge from it." I thought it was like so beautiful. So yeah, I would highly recommend this one. I would highly recommend Garth Greenwell. I think he's an excellent author, and I will try basically anything he writes from now on. And I have 2 more books to talk about, so both of these I really loved. The first one is The Face of War by Martha Gellhorn. I got this again from the library. I picked this up because I had read Flaneuse by Lauren Elkin a couple of months ago, and one of the women that she talks about in it is Martha Gellhorn, who's a female war correspondent. She's American, and she covered many different wars. So specifically in that book, she talks about the Spanish Civil War that she reports on, but the selection of war correspondence I read from her covered many different wars. So to start with, she talks about the Spanish Civil War, then she talks about the war in China, World War II, war in Java. She talks about war in Palestine and in Central America, so Panama, and then there's quite a large section of the Vietnam War. So this book was really interesting because there are some of these wars that I knew very little about, like especially the war in Java, the war in Vietnam. I obviously knew some stuff about, but like not really the actual events, just the general like sort of what had happened. And so this book was really amazing for like giving a good overview of all of these different wars. And also what I really like about her writing is that she is very personal. She went to all of these war zones, and it's sort of like it's like little scenes that she experienced. So during the Second World War part, there's a bit where she's on a hospital ship that goes to Normandy landings to pick up injured soldiers. So I thought that was really interesting. The one thing I would say about it is, and she acknowledges this herself, because at the start of the section about each different war, she writes like a couple of page introduction, and she says herself in the part about World War II that obviously as an American going into World War II, she's very prejudiced against the German soldiers, like more so than is warranted. You know, quite a lot of these people are just average soldiers. They're not like high command Nazis, and the way that she speaks about them is like, wow, she really hates them, which I completely understand why, but I think like reading it now, you're like, whoa. And then yeah, some of her views on things, I think especially the war in Palestine, with everything that's going on in Palestine and Israel just now, like it's yeah, she definitely is very pro Israel, and she makes her reasons clear for that, but that obviously was written a long time ago. I don't need to agree with every view that someone holds to be able to get a lot of enjoyment out of a book like that. She obviously is American, so her views on colonialism are definitely interesting for that time period. So when she talks about Java, it's about sort of the Dutch colonialists there, and she says, oh well, the people in Java want to rule themselves, but when I asked them, okay, well, what do you want to do, they said, oh well, we want freedom. And I said, well yeah, but what are you going to do with that freedom? And they said, well, I don't know, but we want freedom. And she's kind of suggesting that these people are better cared for under colonialism, which I don't obviously agree with, but I still think it's a really interesting book, and it gave me a really good overview of all of these wars and a really good perspective on it. So I'd highly recommend this one if you like that sort of thing. And then my last and my favourite book of the month is The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. So I'm quite annoyed at myself for not having picked this up sooner, because this book has been sat on my bookshelf for years, and I just put it off because I'd heard it compared to 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which is a book that like I liked parts of it, but overall I didn't love it as much as I heard some people like. So I just wasn't sure how I would find this one, but I can see the comparisons a lot, and I think if you liked 100 Years of Solitude, you would also love this book, because it's the story of a family over 4 generations. It's very much centered around a house, and it's magical realism, but not to the same extent that 100 Years of Solitude was. There are women in this book that are sort of psychic, but that's kind of the extent of the magical realism. There's nothing like too weird going on, but I love the characters in this book. I love the writing style. Every single character I was interested in. So it starts with this woman called Clara, who gets married to this landowner called Esteban Trueba, who is like a really not very nice character. He's really in love with her, but he doesn't treat her particularly well, and you know, she's not standing for it. So it's 4 generations of women, and it's set in Chile. It sort of follows the events of the 20th century in Chile, so it follows Salvador Allende's death and then the Pinochet regime. So it's very interesting politically. This is like, I studied Spanish at university, and we did quite a bit about Latin America, so this was something I already had a little bit of knowledge on, but this book just really brought it all to life. And yeah, I just loved every character. I loved the writing style. I think if you like quite beautiful writing, but also characters that are just really fleshed out, I would highly recommend this one. This was like a real joy to read and a real surprise for me. So yeah, that's everything I read in May. I think overall it's been a very successful reading month. I think that DNFing the books that I DNF'd was a really good decision, because it then let me go on and read lots of books that I absolutely loved. So yeah, if you've read any of these books, please let me know and follow along for more.